Okay, so I'm going to talk to you sort of generally about priorities for adaptation, but I'll try and put a Cambridge, or at least a combined authority sort of area slant on it as I go through. And just like to start by talking about reminding us about the need for adaptation. And it was interesting to hear the National Trust on the radio this morning talking about the need for adaptation and the risks to some of their properties, but of course also the risks to some of their lovely coastal landscapes and things from changing sea level rise and much more erosion and things around the coastline. But we have had the hottest 10 years on record. We had a heat wave in 2018, which we thought was fairly extreme, until, of course, we had 40-degree plus temperatures in last summer. And we now know that globally 2023 is likely to be the hottest year on record and likely to have reached, on average, 1.4 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures. So not that that's permanent. Clearly, we've got El Nino, which is helping to increase temperatures, but we're already getting very close, just reminding us we're already getting very close to that 1.5 degree target. And although we tend to think of climate change as being something that affects the southern hemisphere more than us in the northern hemisphere, I think it's interesting to note that actually average temperatures in Europe are rising at something like double the global average at the moment. So climate change is actually happening here even faster than it is in the southern hemisphere. And now down in this southeast part of England, we're already seeing the empirical data shows that we're already seeing maximum temperature rising at something close to 1 degree per decade. And that's likely to go on increasing. So I've said we might get to 43-degree maximum temperatures by mid-century. It wouldn't surprise me if we got to something closer to 45 degrees C temperatures by maximum temperatures, I hasten to add, by mid-century. So there's a lot of heating going on, and we are not immune from it in the Northern Hemisphere and indeed in the UK. And of course, this is about the heating, but that heating, the global heating, is changing weather patterns. And of course, we've seen the kind of storms already this winter that can bring and the flooding that's resulted. So at best, the climate goes on warming until we meet net zero. So hopefully that's not much beyond 2050, but that means temperatures go on rising to 2050 at least, which is why we have to recognize that and change the way we do some things. So I think we're already, I think probably now people will tell us more than 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Even if we're on a path globally to net zero, we can expect pretty much to get up to 2 degrees by 2050. Hot summers like that of 2018 and indeed last summer, which at the moment we have somewhere up to 25% chance of, those will be absolutely typical summers. We can expect that kind of thing with a 50% probability every year. Average summer rainfall will drop. It could drop by as much as 24% in the modelling that people like the Met Office are doing. But certainly we can expect more than 10% drop. Average winter rainfall will increase, and overall things will get wetter, but summers will get much drier. Rainfall, when it comes, is increasingly likely to come in shortish bursts of very heavy rainfall, particularly when we get that rainfall in the summer. So those sorts of conditions when the ground is finding it very hard to absorb rain because it's hard and dry, and the sort of rainfall that leads to surface water flooding, particularly in places like our cities. And the sea level will go on rising. It's already risen 16 centimeters since the beginning of the century of 1900s. It's likely to rise up to about a total 50 centimeter or so rise by mid-century, and it could get to a meter by the end of the century. And indeed, there are some tipping points which mean that it could get even higher than that, but it may not get anything like as high as that, but it is going to continue rising, and it's rising at quite a rate. So there's a lot more climate change. Even if we get to net zero by 2050, there's a lot more climate change to come, which is one of the reasons why adaptation is so important. We've seen how fast the climate's been changing over the past few years. Well, that kind of rate of change is going to continue. And that means we have to think about our buildings. This is an office converted to flats in London, where the internal temperatures reached almost 50 degrees centigrade back in 2018 in those unshaded windows. So we've got to think about how do we protect people in their homes today, but also make sure new buildings are equipped to keep people cool indoors. So we need to be thinking about shading, about shuttering, about blinds, all those sorts of things. And the reason for that is that we see increasing deaths during these periods of hot weather. And the ONS data set suggests we may have seen as many as 4,500 excess deaths during the hot periods during summer of 2022. It also causes us problems in places like our hospitals, where hospital wards overheat. We had incidences in hospitals in the very hot summer last year where they had to stop doing operations because the operating theatres were too hot for it to be safe. And it also, of course, makes us less productive. So companies should be concerned about that, because whether people are working at home or working in company buildings, their productivity drops during those very hot periods. So we've got to keep people in comfortable conditions in order for them to function and be healthy. The other thing, of course, this hot weather does, it brings new pests and diseases, both to our plants, but also to us. So we're seeing mosquitoes that carry dengue fever already in France and parts of Paris having to be fumigated. That's coming here pretty soon. We've seen a big increase in incidences of Lyme disease over the last few years, and in the Scottish forestry estate, they've seen a very rapid growth in needle blight, which can kill trees and make them of too low a quality to be used in construction and the sort of high value uses of those trees. So we need to recognize that there are new kinds of problem, both to humans, but also to plants and animals coming with the hotter weather. We also, and a particular challenge for us in around Cambridgeshire in the East Anglia, is that water shortages will grow, and particularly this southeast corner is particularly susceptible. That these drier summers will mean that the farmland in the fens will find it more challenging to have enough water, and may need to think about different crops. But even more crucially, of course, the farmland in the fens, some of that is on lowland peat, and lowland peat needs to be kept wet in order for it not to dry out and give off more CO2 emissions as it degrades. The other challenge we have, not only do we have the farming here in the fens, but of course we also have the challenge of all of this additional housing that is being proposed for this area, things like the Oxford-Cambridge Arc. And where new housing is built, we really have got to think about making sure it's built to the very highest water efficiency standards, because at the moment we are still in the UK consuming about 140 litres per person per day. We really need to get that down below 100 in order to make sure we don't have the challenges of water efficiency, of water availability for even for us in our homes around this corner of East Anglia by the 2050s. It seems odd to talk about drought and then to talk about flooding, but of course we are getting these wetter winters and these periods of very intense rainfall, and even with the money the Environment Agency has been given, it is still predicted there will be more people at risk of flooding than there are today by the 2050s. And indeed, we heard last week that the Environment Agency is finding it can't do as much as it thought it could do. So actually, I think these numbers are probably increasing in terms of the likely number of people who will be at risk from flooding. When we looked for the the Cambridge and Peterborough Combined Authority Climate Commission at the local region, the University of Cambridge did some analysis work for us, looking at, you know, the hotspots for river flooding and also for surface water flooding. Already we see quite significant numbers of homes and agricultural and industrial facilities affected, but by 2100 it could be 10% of our homes and indeed 25% of our agriculture and industrial facilities affected by river flooding. And surface water flooding, the other map shows you where is susceptible to surface water flooding today. Well, by 2050, we're going to have significantly more winter rainfall, and indeed we're going to have more of those periods of very intense rainfall. So again, this map of surface water flooding by 2050 will be looking significantly more pink and purple. So again, it's about, are we taking the right steps today to help people in those affected areas install property level flood resilience where that's appropriate? And indeed, are we, wherever possible, avoiding lock-in? Are we making sure that we are not building new developments in flood risk areas today, but actually flood risk areas in 2040 and flood risk areas in 2050? And as you can see from the map, there have been some quite significant new developments in our region, although we're far from the worst in terms of building in existing floodplains. So we really do need to be trying to make sure that things we do today don't lock us into problems for tomorrow. And then coming back to a very important issue for us in the region because of all of the farming, is that the combination of the wetter winters, the drier summers, the hotter summers, the new pests and diseases means that the things that we will be able to grow successfully in the region will change. Now, here's an example of two types of tree. The first of all shows you that the whole of the southeast of England is going to become increasingly unsuitable for beech trees as we approach 2050. So if you're planning a new hedge in Cambridge and you want it to be there for a good long time, beech is probably not the right thing to be thinking about. Less relevant to us, but Sitka spruce, you can also see that the Sitka spruce is going to be moving rapidly northwards. So, you know, Sitka spruce is used extensively for wood in construction and things. But this also, of course, applies to crops that people may be growing in their fields. You know, the lack of water may mean that potatoes are unsuitable. And it also, of course, means that soft fruit and other things may be becoming more suitable. And one of the trends, of course, we are seeing in the UK is a lot more vineyards, particularly in the southeast, but now moving up into the Midlands and even into the south of Scotland. On the other hand, that's not going to feed us. So there are probably more important crops that we need to be thinking about in the fens in terms of how farming is going to manage to continue in these different climatic conditions. And we need to be thinking about issues like how do we ensure farmers are enabled to have more on-farm water storage so that it can store that additional water that's coming down in the winter and have it available for using when we get very dry periods in the spring and the summer. So as the Climate Change Committee, we comment on how we are progressing towards developing resilience across the country, and how is the government doing in terms of being the leader for that activity. Well, in our last report on the climate change risk assessment, which was back in 2021, the climate change risk assessment had identified 62, the third one, which came, the third climate change risk assessment, which was published the evidence for it was published in 2021. The actual risk assessment from the government was presented to Parliament last year. It had 64 areas for attention, 64 areas of risk and opportunity, mainly, of course, risk. And 54 of those were in the highest category needing urgent attention. But given that governments find it rather challenging to cope with over 60 risks, we, in our independent advice to them from the Climate Change Committee, we said, well, I think we thought there were 8 things that we felt they needed to look at immediately, because those things were associated with legislation that was either kind of being passed or being discussed, or they were things that impacted on our achievement of net zero. So things that really did need immediate attention. The first 4 of those are to do with nature and farming. So looking at freshwater, terrestrial and freshwater habitats, and the whole range of climate hazards that affect them. Looking at soil health, and that's a particularly critical one for us, of course, in the fens. Again, having talked about the fact that we have quite a lot of the UK's lowland peat, and of course it's very, very fertile, but flooding and drought, of course, removes topsoil. We also, as I know, have quite a lot of clay, and drying out of that clay in the very hot summers is, of course, affecting things like cracking in our homes. And that's something that last summer they noticed very, very significantly in France, where they had a very dry summer. They had a lot of wildfires. They've seen a lot of building damage because of drying soil and cracking of walls in buildings. So risks to soil health, all sorts of reasons, that's hugely important, and a big impact of flooding and drought. So we urgently need the soil strategy in the UK to be both published and implemented. Relevant again to us, risks to natural carbon stores. So that's trees, but it's also peat. And if those, of course, if our trees start to die and if our peat dries out, it emits CO2, and that makes the challenge even greater. Risks to crops, livestock, trees from multiple hazards, and again relevant to our farmers. Risks to food supply, in part from these things above, but of course in part from flooding on our roads potentially, and of course from things that will be happening with climate change occurring overseas. And again, we saw during COVID some of the challenges that happens when our supply chains and our distribution networks are affected. Risks to people from climate-related failure of the power system. This is one of the ones that's particularly pertinent to net zero, because today about 15% of the energy we use, and that's electricity, that's gas, and that's oil, only about 15% of that is electricity. By the time we get to 2050, with a decarbonised electricity system, with predominantly electric vehicles, with predominant electric heating in our homes, then something like 70% of our energy will come from electricity. So we will be very, very dependent on this new electricity system that is currently being built to meet the net zero targets. So it is really critical that as that system is being built, resilience is being built in right from the word go. Last winter before last, we saw people in Scotland left for a period of a week in some areas without electricity after a severe storm. That's not going to be acceptable by the time we get to 2050, where people will be so dependent on electricity. We've then got risks to human health, well-being and productivity from exposure to heat. And we felt that with the plans for so many new homes being built, that was one that the government should have as an absolute priority. And we have now seen the change to building regulations in England, but of course that only covers new homes, which now have to be built to stay cool in summer. It doesn't cover conversions. It doesn't cover permitted developments where people are turning office blocks into flats and things like that. They've done a bit better in Scotland. Their planning reform does cover conversions, but also it doesn't cover help for existing householders to make their homes more climate resilient. And we think that as we're asking householders to make changes like installing heat pumps, the government should be looking at adaptation and mitigation together and be giving people support for putting in measures to keep their homes cool in summer at the same time. And then we said also that the government needed to be looking at multiple risks to the UK from climate change overseas. Those are things like affecting our critical supply chains, but they will also start to be things like refugees and indeed conflict stimulated by climate change overseas. So those were what we said to the government we thought were the absolute priorities it needed to be looking at. And we said this was what we thought good adaptation policy would look like. That first of all, the government needed to give us a vision for a well-adapted UK so that we knew what the government was aiming for, so that businesses and people knew what it was the government was trying to achieve, and therefore so that we could say what is our role in also supporting that achievement. But also a vision that enables us to measure progress towards it, because that's the challenge we have on the Climate Change Committee. Unlike mitigation, where we have the carbon budgets and we can measure progress, we don't have a picture of what the UK might look like, a resilient UK might look like in 2050 or 2080, so that we can measure whether government policy is helping us to move in that direction. We said adaptation must be integrated into all other policies, particularly when we're thinking about, for example, the policies to drive decarbonisation. We should also be thinking about impacts on adaptation. We should be assuming that we'll get 2 degrees of warming in our plans, and we should be looking at what are the risks if it were to be significantly worse than that. We shouldn't be building in floodplains and other things that lock us into problems and costs for the future. We should prepare for these sort of unpredictable extremes, some of which we've been seeing globally. We should assess interdependencies. So we should be looking at, how does a failure in the electricity system affect the water system, affect other essential provisions for people? So understanding who we're dependent on and how resilient they are. We should understand threshold effect. So that's when, rather than the linear changes, we tend to assume when we might get an abrupt change. So some things like some of the glacier melting, some of the threshold effects we've heard about there would be an example. We must absolutely recognise that adaptation affects, that climate change impacts and adaptation have a very, very important inequality issue around them, not just the global north from the global south, but poor people who have less money to take adaptation action, who may be more affected by flooding because they live in a cheaper area where the flood resilience is less good. There tends to be a downward spiral for less well-off people in terms of climate impact. So we must address inequalities. We do need to look at the opportunities. Are there, could we be growing apricots in Cambridgeshire? But they aren't going to balance out the challenges. And we need the right kind of funding and resourcing to make this happen. And we need the metrics so that we can tell whether we are making a difference. And then finally, a rather dismal slide, I'm afraid. This was our assessment in March this year of the progress that we are making in England in delivering adaptation. And the inner circle of colours shows policies and plans, and the outer circle shows how far we're getting with making a difference, the implementation of those plans and the resulting increase in resilience. And the black areas show where we have no data to be able to make an assessment. So overall, we are seeing progress, some progress in policies and plans. Those are better in the water industry and some areas of transport in towns and cities than others. So some progress in policies and plans, but very little measurable progress in terms of implementation of those policies and plans, or us being able to be confident that that implementation is making us more resilient in the UK. So a lot more work and a lot more investment is needed. And we really do need to get the government to take this more seriously than it has been doing to date. So thank you very much. And I will stop sharing at that point.
Thank you very much, Julia. That was frightening and awesome. If people would like to ask a question, please, I think the best way of doing this will be to raise your hands, your electronic hands, if for some reason you are unable to find your electronic candle to use it, and it should be in the responses reactions tab at the bottom of the screen. And then do put it in chat and we'll try and spot that you want to ask a question. I'm going to ask the first one, which is absolutely agree. We've got to have measures we've got to be adapting and tracking that. And in Cambridgeshire, what metrics do you think, or measures do you think would be the appropriate ones that you'd like to see us tracking?
I certainly think in Cambridgeshire we should be looking at the water metrics. So we should be looking at the water consumption on a per capita basis. We should also be looking at the leakage metrics from our water companies, because those are two very important things that we need to be reducing. We should also be looking at the number of homes in areas of flood risk and the number of those homes that have property level flood resilience. So where we know there may be instances that won't be protected by the flood barriers or whatever the Environment Agency may have erected, or the temporary ones they may be able to bring in, how are people being enabled to install property level flood resilience? Indeed, we should be tracking things like how well insured homes in flood risk areas are, and because they should be able to access flood risk insurance, but because of the flood insurance scheme. But I think in terms of knowing how well people will recover, it's important to understand whether they are being able to access and have been able to take out insurance. We should be doing, I think, schemes to look at temperature monitoring of temperatures inside key buildings during hot periods. So we should be looking at how well protected our hospitals are. It would be good to have some knowledge about how well protected houses in Cambridgeshire are from those very hot internal temperatures.
Thank you. John Preston.
Right. Mine is more on the policy side. With a general election coming up next year, how do you, wearing your climate change committee hat, see the possibilities for getting a vision for a well-adapted UK from any of the main political parties?
Well, we will keep pressing for it. We have been talking to the main political parties about the things that we think we need to see, and I think the political parties need to recognise that actually there's something very positive about a vision for a well-adapted UK. At the moment, we're hearing awful stories about children feeling very frightened about what the world may look like and the implications of climate change. By actually putting out a vision for a well-adapted UK, which is both has targets so that we can measure progress, but is also descriptive, we can certainly in this country, we can tell a very good story of how this it can remain a very nice place to live. We should be focusing on how we plan our towns and cities to have more green space, how we make sure that there is particularly more green space in areas of relative deprivation, because we know from studies in the UK and particularly in the US that deprived areas tend to have less access to outside space. So when it gets really hot, there aren't outdoor places with lovely shady trees where people can go. And indeed, you don't get the benefits in terms of absorbing water to address surface water flooding, and indeed the transpiration of the plants and the trees helping to cool the urban heat island effect. So there are kind of positive things you can put into a vision of a well-adapted UK, which show people that we're striving to make this a place where it is a very civilized place to continue working and living. And actually we can correct some of the things that we haven't got right historically in terms of putting that vision together. So it ought to be a good way of communicating with people about that a government cares about them, and that a government's real priorities are the safety and the welfare of its population. So we're trying to persuade our all parties that that's something that would go down well, because actually people find mitigation pretty abstract. They don't know how much CO2 is there in the atmosphere. They've kind of understood that we've got to get to net zero, but it's nothing you can see. People are genuinely seeing the changes in the climate and how they're being affected by them, and people are worried about them. So I think there's a real opportunity for politicians to pick up on this one.
Thank you. I don't see anybody else with a hand up. Do put your hand up. Oh, Sean.
Can I just check? Can you hear me first? Because the
Yes.
yeah, that's great. So thank you very much, Baroness Brown, for a wonderfully clear presentation. My question, which actually is quite similar to Robert's in the chat, is really around exemplars, whether other countries or even or actually within the UK, particular areas that are doing really well in this area of adaptation, and who they are and what we might learn from them.
Well, that's an interesting question. The United States has just published its adaptation strategy, and that's got that looks very good. I'm not sure it has everything that you need in it, but it certainly is looking good. Wales and Scotland have gone a bit further in defining what a well-adapted. I should explain that climate change risks are a national issue. Climate change adaptation is done by each of the four separate nations, because it comes under environment, which is of course a devolved accountability. So the adaptation plans for Scotland and Wales both have a better approach to describing what a well-adapted Scotland or a well-adapted Wales look like. They haven't yet got the right levels of targets in them, but they're better at the description than the latest English national adaptation plan is. Neither Wales nor Scotland are making particularly good progress on actually demonstrating that that the measures they're taking or the plans they've got are having a significant impact. Wales, of course, has the advantage of they do it under the umbrella of the well-being of future generations legislation that they have. And so in theory, they're obliged to be doing things that take into account the well-being of future generations. And of course, climate change mitigation and adaptation come very strongly into that. If we look at places in the UK, I think there are many cities, and I'm sure Cambridge is one of them, that have some areas of good practice. I think we, a while ago, had a presentation from Kent County Council, and in Kent they were trying a very large number of initiatives. They had a big initiative on more street trees, particularly in areas around old people's homes, so that to encourage the residents to be able to come out and walk along a cool street in the summer. And they were tying the planting of those street trees into the drainage system, so that they would help also to address drainage on roads, that the drainage system and the roots of the trees were combined in some quite clever ways. Kent were also working with their farming community, looking at helping to support the transition both to vineyards, but also to growing of apricots and peaches and things, where it was becoming too hot and dry to grow some of the more traditional crops that they'd produce. So they seem to have a number of quite innovative approaches, and they had also developed a mapping system that enabled them to look at where were the concentrations of disadvantaged peoples, where were the areas of flood risk, where were the roads that might be affected in the case of flooding, where were the care homes and things, so that they could do better emergency planning, recognizing the people they might need to focus on and the particular challenges they might have in terms of a climate related incident. So they seem to have really quite an active activity, but they were saying that quite a lot that had been traditionally funded by EU funding, and they were very worried how they were going to be able to continue with some of that work now that obviously the funding conditions are different. So it was lots of positives, but also also rather sad as well that they won't be able to extend some of these initiatives into a more extensive, move them from trials into more extensive implementation. But that's that's not the only place, and I wouldn't like to just make other places where I know Bristol and other cities that I know have been doing good things. So there's quite a lot of good work going on, and one of the things that we're going to be doing on the Climate Change Committee as we start to think about the 4th climate change risk assessment and the 7th carbon budget, we're going to be producing another report looking at what local authorities can do.
Bob.
Good morning. Brilliant presentation. It'd be fantastic if we could get the slides in at some point in the future. I just wanted to ask Baroness Brown a specific question about sea level rise. You mentioned glacial melt, and I've always been particularly worried about coastal defences in the fens, and of course if we don't get our act together and sort them out in the near future, then the majority of Cambridgeshire, I'm told, will be underwater within the next 20 or 30 years. And I wondered whether you had any information or confidence that the coastal defences were indeed being upgraded and improved to prevent that from happening.
Well, the Environment Agency did get the funding it requested, I think 3 years back, for its flood and coastal erosion management plan. Certainly on the capital side, it's not entirely clear it has adequate operating costs, and it is now seeing the challenge that costs are increasing. But they are certainly working on the coastal defences. We need to make sure that we don't think that in all places just putting more and more concrete in place will be the solution, and we do need to be looking at are there places where we should be managing new kind of salt marsh and wetland creation as part of the defences, and so we need to be thinking about how we do that. We also, all around the coast of England, we have processes called the shoreline management plans. So every section of coast around England has its shoreline management plans. One of the things that we have been pushing the government on is that at the moment those are non-statutory plans, and we believe they should become statutory plans, so they have to be taken into account in local planning around the coast. And also, of course, if they become statutory plans, they have to be funded, and that's the challenge at the moment. As non-statutory plans, they're kind of advisory, but they aren't necessarily taken into account in local plans. And some of them are very aspirational, but there is no obvious route to funding. So people are sort of travelling rather hopefully in terms of thinking about what might be protected, what might be protected, and where the money might come from. So I think we do need to be thinking more about that around our coast, yes. But there are plans in place, and the Environment Agency does have the capital budget that it asked for in its strategy that was published, I think, about 2 years ago. So it's not awful, but it's not brilliant.
Thank you.
Anybody else got a question, or should I take one from chat? There was a suggestion from chat on the latest ones from John again. Could it be part of the Committee on Climate Change's role to hold public online events or hustings to put the competing parties on the spot?
I think as an independent advisor, that would be a very difficult thing for us to do. And actually, having just tried to persuade Labour to come and give us evidence to my House of Lords Select Committee on an issue to do with the electricity system, they have declined to do so. And you can understand that, really, because they're, our role, in my other hat, our role as a Select Committee is to hold government to account, not actually to hold the opposition to account for its plans. So at this point, why would they? Why would they say yes to that? So I think it would be probably a difficult thing for us to do in our role as an independent public body.
And what are your thoughts about public transport? Oh, sorry, Roger Mitchell, you've got a question. Roger, you're being muted, sorry.
I beg your pardon. I'm not sure this is so much of a question, Baroness Brown, as an observation, but you mentioned just a short time ago about the use of the services provided by salt marshes in preventing coastal erosion. Similarly, our flood meadows do this, and what concerns me is that for the flyer for this talk, and indeed a slide was shown of the flooding at St Ives, and I've stood on the bridge there, and I've heard people say, "Oh, isn't this awful?" This is a perfectly natural condition. They are flood meadows. They've been flooding for 100 years. They by capturing the water on those meadows, spilling the water on the meadows, they prevent the water spilling elsewhere in the catchment. There's an even bigger flood just upstream at Porthome near Godmanchester, a big flood meadow there. I think it's the biggest flood meadow in Britain. So I think my observation or my question is about public perception. Do you think there's a chance that we can sharpen up public perception of this? Because I don't think there's a full appreciation of the ecosystem services provided either by salt marshes or by flood meadows. So really it's an observation with a sort of a question.
I think it comes to some extent with people having an understanding of what a well-adapted UK looks like. And of course, the Environment Agency has had quite a strong focus on catchment level flood management. So as you say, using the flooding of farmland and those sorts of undeveloped floodplains as an important part of how we manage flooding, and making sure that we use that wherever we can to keep flooding away from towns and cities and settlements. And also, of course, using catchment level tree planting in order to slow down waters rushing into rivers, to slow down river flows, and also in some cases putting the bends back into rivers to slow down river flow. So I think a whole range of nature-based solutions that we are getting increasingly good modelling of how well they can help us support flood management in various locations. Yes.
Perhaps a question I'll ask if anybody else, I don't know if anybody else wants to put their hand up, but in the meantime, what do you think should be done in the fens? Because, you know, on the one hand, one hears interesting ideas about paddy culture and there's some wonderful projects growing bulrushes and things like that. But on the other hand, if actually the reality is that they're going to dry out, what do we do? Because clearly the carbon emissions from the fens dominate the carbon emissions, certainly for East Cambs, Huntingdonshire, and they're pretty important for South Cambs too.
Well, I think that this one of the areas that government really has to take a lead on and get to grips with, because of course we have some of the best deep lowland peat in the country in the fens, and it's used very extensively for agriculture. Some farmers have been looking at raised growing with raised water levels in their fields, but it was brought home to me, I think, very, very effectively on a visit to farms in the fens, of just how challenging that is, particularly with the large fields we now farm, because in order to do that, you've got to have kind of centimetre precision on the level of a large field, and that's almost, that really is almost impossible. And where you can do it, it's hugely expensive to level fields to that extent. We think of the fens as being flat, but they aren't flat on that kind of scale. And if you really want to bring the water level up to not far below where you're planting, the danger of getting puddles and boggy patches in fields is really challenging. So there may be some areas where that can be done, and that's a very good thing. But I think the government really does need to think about what is it going to do about lowland peat, and what alternatives is it going to offer farmers if we decide that where we still have really deep lowland peat, perhaps in the future we should decide we aren't going to farm that. But farmers need to be engaged in that discussion and thinking about their future livelihoods and things while that discussion is going on. Otherwise, we will just get resistance to change, perfectly natural resistance to the sort of changes that might be needed.
So would you actually support putting solar farms on some of the deep peat, because obviously in some areas that's been quite controversial, and some people are feeling that, well, grade 1 agricultural land shouldn't be used for solar. But
and that's certainly something I have been thinking about, that that it may well be that is a good solution in some areas, and of course solar farms can still support some level of agriculture. Sheep quite like solar farms.
As do some vegetables, I gather. In fact,
Oh, right. Well, that's
scaling improves things.
So if you can combine those things whilst protecting whilst generating electricity and protecting the peat, there seem to me that's the sort of innovative thinking that we need to have going on.
Yeah. So, any more questions? I know there's some people here who are very interested in what one could do to stop homes overheating, and obviously on a sort of community level, starting putting Cambridge Carbon Footprint, putting on events about how to stay cool in a heat wave.
Well, and you only have to go on holiday in France and realise that how we really do have to get people to change their behaviours. That you go through a French town on a hot sunny day, and every house looks as if it's empty because they're all shuttered, and we are still in this country so attracted by the sun that we throw open all the windows. and we do need to train people up in some new behaviors, particularly for these periods of very hot weather. And those things that you open the window when the air is cold, when the air outside is colder than indoors, and you close the window when the air outside, you close the window and the blinds or the curtains or the shutters when the air outside is hotter than the air inside, and that isn't natural to us. I know it's not natural to me.
No, we need to get our planning authorities to realise that shutters are actually a positively good thing, and certainly,
yes,
as you say, we end up with 45 degrees C on extreme heat waves, in the next few decades. That really is something.
Well, 40 degrees was pretty pretty alarming, wasn't it? Yes.
It was indeed. Good. Okay. Well, unless there are any final questions, I think we'll wrap up. We can keep the Zoom meeting open for a bit longer if people want to stay and chat, but I think we'll need to release Baroness Brown. So thank you enormously. Would it be okay for you to share the slides with us?
Yes, I'll turn them into a PDF and send them over to you, Anne.
That's great. So we'll put them on our website.